to give everyone kind of a brief overview. So every 2 weeks, we have a live peer community call. Usually a few people join and participate, but we're also streaming it and recording it and share it out to the community afterwards. This week, we have kind of a special agenda where Nelson, who's here with us, Nelson Ryan, is going to moderate a discussion, not just about live peer, but with a bunch of people from different projects about governance and decentralized governance in crypto projects. So kind of an interesting new topic, and we can talk a little bit about how we're thinking about it in live peer and kind of how we get from where we are today to more decentralized participation. So I guess we can give everyone like 1 or 2 more minutes to join, and then Nelson can kick it off.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Doug.
Just from a technical perspective, I guess, kind of a few of the guests and myself who we kind of invited to participate in the discussion, maybe we try staying on video for now. If we do end up with kind of connectivity issues or disruptions, we can go audio only. And if everyone else could kind of go turn off their video, mute their audio, that would help. And I think, Nelson, I guess if people maybe want to jump in and participate, they're of course welcome to, but maybe start by typing something in the chat window to kind of prompt you as you're moderating, and you can kind of call them in as necessary.
Yeah, no, completely. And if anyone has any questions, if you'd like to just chuck it in the chat while we're talking, that way I can sort of get to it once we sort of got through all the questions we have sort of pre-planned. Yeah.
Great. All right. So I guess we can probably go ahead and kick it off. And just as a reminder, currently streaming on livepeer.tv or crypto.livepeer.tv, I believe we're trying at least, and recording it so we can share it out later to the community. All right, Nelson, I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Doug. So hi, everyone. So my name is Nelson. So I'm head of APAC at the Reserve. And today I'm here to talk about, yes, we're talking about governance within crypto networks generally. So I was talking to Doug about governance within live peer specifically. And obviously it's a very sort of difficult topic that's constantly evolving. So we thought it'd be really interesting to invite people from a few different projects and the broader Ethereum ecosystem to jump in and have a bit of a chat about where we think it's going and some of the issues involved. So I guess to kick us off, I thought we might sort of go through and introduce ourselves. So obviously, yeah, that Doug's on the call. So Kevin, would you mind just giving yourself a brief introduction?
Yeah, happy to. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Iwaki. I am a founder at Gitcoin, which is not a token. It's a place where you can get coins if you're a software engineer. And so we built a double-sided market that connects funders to coders and allows them to work together from anywhere in the world and exchange crypto tokens in exchange for their work. And I think that LivePeer has done a couple bounties with us. So thanks for having us on the call.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Kevin. And Arthur, would you mind sort of introducing yourself? Oh, I think Arthur might be having some audio problems. I'm just
Can you hear me, guys?
Oh, hey. Yep, we can hear you. I think you may have cut out again. Okay, well, anyway, look, I might just give Arthur a brief introduction, and then hopefully his connection gets a little bit better. So we invite Arthur on, who's head of growth from Foam, to sort of chip in and talk a little bit about how Foam's thinking about governance within their network. So anyway, so to get started, I think we might just go through some of the questions that we posed, but I think I would also just add that basically, like, there's a pretty open discussion, and obviously, like, it's the very early stages of talking about these sort of topics. So I think there's no right or wrong answers, but I think it's really helpful to sort of talk it through. So the first question was, what does decentralized governance mean within this sort of space, and how do you sort of think about it as people within the sort of Ethereum ecosystem?
Great. So that's a huge topic and a big question to begin with. I like it. I think the power of these networks, kind of starting with Bitcoin first and foremost, even before Ethereum, is that there's no central party that's in control and able to make the decisions. But at the same time, you of course need kind of continued technical innovation. You need updates to the protocol. You need support for bug fixes. You need community participation. You need governance over how funds get allocated and resources get allocated to build out these ecosystems. And so how do you create these kind of collective actions amongst kind of widely distributed group of people and participants and stakeholders to move everything forward in kind of the same or multiple directions? And that's a huge governance challenge. And there's lots of different approaches. There's lots of different experiments being run. That's probably one of the most interesting areas that Ethereum itself has kind of accelerated the adoption of, is the ability to run these governance experiments. But I don't think anyone has the perfect answer. And I think we're going to learn a lot from watching how some of these experiments and how some of these projects play out in the coming years. I'm sure on the call today we can talk about a lot of specific examples. I also noticed, I think Lane may have just joined the call.
Hey guys, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. Hey, Lane.
Hey, thank you so much for including me. Great to see everyone that I know, and great to meet the folks I don't. I'm out and about, so I probably won't be able to turn on video for a few minutes. It might take me a sec to respond if I'm muted, but I'm here.
Great, thanks for joining us. Yeah, Nelson was just kind of kicking off, kind of moderating a discussion on governance, a topic that you obviously have written a lot about recently. So I'm sure he'll prompt you as you can be useful to the conversation.
Sure. Yeah, excited about the topic and happy to contribute.
Okay, brilliant. And Lane, would you mind just giving a brief introduction to yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Lane. I am a core developer on the EWASM team. That's kind of my day job, is focusing on the project to replace the EVM with the EWASM-based virtual machine for ETH2 and maybe as part of the ETH1X roadmap. However, I've been increasingly hands-on with governance. Just sort of echoing some of the sentiments I heard Doug mention a moment ago. I think there's a little bit of a governance and kind of leadership and vision void in Ethereum. It's kind of become obvious to me recently. So yeah, I mean, I've just been sort of trying to step up some efforts in that direction. Been very active with the ETH1X initiative. Also been in the process of launching this sort of cat herders initiative that I'm sure many of you saw with folks like Hudson and Afri.
Yeah, okay, brilliant. Thanks for that. And all right, so now, the question we were just going through, I'll just repeat it from Arthur and Lane. So the question was just, what does decentralized governance mean to you? So Lane, yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
What does decentralized governance mean to me? Well, that's such a big topic. I don't think I have a super insightful answer. I think governance to me is kind of like finding efficient ways for, a diverse group of stakeholders to solve problems and allocate resources effectively at a very high level. And I think, that's sort of, I would just add that's sort of hard enough to do in a centralized fashion. I think I have yet to see a functional, effective example of governance, of distributed governance, decentralized governance at scale, right? There's a reason that like many large companies have kind of run experiments and sort of given up on the attempt. Yeah, that's my thought. Okay,
great. And now, Kevin, would you mind sort of chipping in on that question as well?
Yeah. So I got to be honest with everyone that I feel a little bit out of my depth on this. Gitcoin purposefully chose to focus with our limited resources on what our customers want. And so if you're an employer, you want to meet coders, you want candidate flow. If you're a coder, you want to get coins in exchange for your work in coding. And I'm the kind of guy who likes to sit around with the Colorado blockchain organizers on a Friday night and have a glass of wine and debate distributed governance a little bit, but we haven't put it in practice at all in any sort of sober way. And I think it's just because we've been focused so much on our users that you know, we didn't do an ICO, so we never had to like publish anything and like a white paper that would talk about how we'd be governed once the founders are gone. And we're all sort of sent, like, admittedly at right now, centralized and you know, funded by Joe Lubin and Consensus. And so we haven't really had to solve the hard problems of governance because we don't have a DAO and we never had to write a white paper or anything like that. We've just been focused on our core users. So what my hope has been that the smarter brains in the space, like the Aragon folks and the DAO Stack guys, we're going to come up with sort of like a DAO in a box that someone like me, that's well-intentioned but just focused on other shit, could implement. Like when I build a website now, I use Ruby on Rails in order to build my web scaffolding faster. And I don't have a lot of like intelligent things to say about resource allocation and governance when it comes to decentralized governance, other than I'm a potential customer for whoever figures it out, and please just give me a DAO in a box that I can apply to Gitcoin. Because my need as someone who's a founder of a DApp of a DApp that's in use is that I want to be able to focus on delivering value to my customers, and I need you to show me the way with respect to how to turn Gitcoin from where it is now in centralized and funded by Consensus into what it could be, which is a totally distributed network where people own stakes and have aligned incentives.
Okay, yeah, no, I think that's a really fair answer. Okay, so I see Arthur was just dropping off. Are you there, Arthur?
I am here, off and on. I hope you guys can hear me. I'm having some issues with my internet connection. Okay,
cool. Yeah, no, we can hear you. So yeah, what does decentralization or decentralized governance mean to yourself and Foam?
Well, maybe to echo Lane. Yeah, it's very complicated. I think as all people that work with this, it's a complicated relationship where you have this ambition, and the deeper you get while of trying to maybe implement both the processes within your network and within the organizational structure that is trying to build the network, which is the kind of double thing that many people are doing. You very directly understand the complexity of it. Both privately and in the networks you're building. So yeah, I mean, we're trying to. For us, it's two things. Who sets the parameters of the network, and also who can participate. I mean, it's a very general question. I think I'll pass on a direct specification.
Along the lines, though, of it being such like a general question, I think you were just alluding to some of the specifics that actually projects have to consider and face, right? So you said one is how do the parameters of a network get set, right?
Yeah.
Two, closely related to that, is how does the underlying protocol itself get upgraded, and how does it evolve over time? And then maybe like a third area, which is a little less related, that applies to some projects and others, how do funds and resources get allocated and distributed if this is truly a global network and there is some aspect of funds that the network controls that's not in control of any individual party. And so, shifting from kind of the general abstract to the practical, I think those might be some areas we can like focus on in this call.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree. I think it is a very general question, but part of the reason I did want to bring it up is I think as a space, we often talk about terms like, decentralized governance, but I think that term actually means different things to different projects and to different people within the whole ecosystem. So I think it's interesting to sort of unpack some of these terms to actually kind of, and I think it's also not like a black and white thing. It's definitely more of a spectrum.
Nelson, like you said earlier, and I think another interesting point here is that this is Eric, by the way. I'm also from the LiveCare team. Another thing that you mentioned is that like different projects are at different stages, right? And they're at different levels of decentralization already. So there are projects who are operating pretty much as a core as one company. There are projects who are operating in a hybrid model, and there are projects that are operating in a very decentralized fashion. And of course, governance is going to mean very different things to them. So for example, I think for a completely decentralized project right now, decentralized governance is basically the entire, like, it's like the decentralized version of like setting up a company process and setting up how things get done, setting up how decisions get made, and all of those things, right, in this decentralized network. Versus for a project that's operating by a centralized team and somewhat following a centralized way of operations, and then decentralized governance is more about like, how can we empower the community to, like, how can we empower the stakeholders in the ecosystem to take on more and more actions to like to make the project succeed.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point, Eric. And also like thinking of it as a process. And some projects have decided to decentralize, you know, certain parts first. Like for example, the treasury, or perhaps on-chain voting. So taking different sort of parts of the project and giving that to the community. So I think, yeah, no, it's very interesting to sort of think about that. All right, so the second question we're going to run through is, what are the challenges of implementing decentralized governance within crypto networks? So I guess if we think about it in terms of some of those things we talked about, so whether that's control on decisions, resources, or perhaps even how decisions are made within the organization. So yeah, Doug, would you like to kick us off on that first question?
Well, I think before you have implementation, you have design, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're shifting where, let's say, treasury management is fully decentralized, designing it correct in the first place in order to enable this network to actually complete the task of allocating funds in a way that fuels the growth of the ecosystem is a really tricky problem. And if you can't run experiments, if you don't have any control to change things or fix things or adjust as you go, then you know, deploying the design that you implemented and kind of handing over the entire network's, you know, in this case, treasury management or parameter setting to whatever you design is just a huge unknown and a huge risk. So I think the challenge as a team is like, how do you get it right? And how do you iterate towards it? And I really lean towards the mechanisms that allow you to run small, low stakes experiments, as opposed to go from 0 to 60 and throw away the keys and just hand over kind of the whole future of the network to what you hoped was a correct design without testing it. So an example in LivePeer is that each transcoder node in LivePeer earns fees and earns rewards, and many have campaigned that, hey, we'd like to use these fees and rewards to invest in some effort, whether it's community building or whether it's building a piece of software or you know, working on relationships. And right now, those efforts are still kind of like centralized in the hands of the node operator. They said, we'd like to do this as a community. We'd like to do this as a DAO. We'd like to let people make proposals and receive these fees or rewards as the community agrees on them. And that's like a really nice low stakes experiment to run as it relates to decentralized governance, because you can kind of spin up this node, have it allocate some funds, let people opt in to delegate to participate, and see what comes of it and see what's effective and what's not effective, without having to say, well, the entire protocol is allocating some centralized or some pool of funds, and we have to hand over, you know, the allocation rights to this whole network without knowing whether that'll work effectively or not. So anyway, it's just a small example of like a way I think you can run an experiment.
Yeah, okay, cool. I think that's really helpful. And yeah, I guess that kind of comes back to that point of it being a process, not just sort of immediately going all in right from the very start. Okay, great. So Arthur, Lane, or Kevin, would you like to jump in on that one?
I'm happy to speak a little bit about that. Well, I don't know if I think we also think of our TCR, our token curated registry, as a form of governance in this, and we have this token curated registry where people have successfully come to agreement on maps added to the points over time now. And we have a social layer where people, so that is for us, so we have the general parameters of the network, and then we also have a governance, the TCR surrounding the points added to the map, which is a smaller scale within that, within those parameters. And yeah, that's I don't know if, do you want me to speak on that a little bit maybe, and what we've learned from that?
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Well, so generally, I think what we've learned is that we had this idea, and this is a TCR space thing, that the social layer, so the discussion around these points will be much more than we thought. We thought it would be much more, and the where it really jumps out is these spaces where you have conflicts in real life as well. So you have some territorial conflicts between Japan and China, for example. Those islands jump out as problematic, and then you need a social layer on top for discussions surrounding that. We have wheat stores in Spain that jump out as like complicated, and right now we're trying to design the social layers surrounding those discussions and how to reach agreements surrounding that. And then long term, we have of course more of a goal to fully decentralize the parameters surrounding the protocol itself. But right now, that is the our learnings and what we're doing.
Hey, okay, sorry, I just got a bit of background noise at the moment. All right, so yeah, Kevin, did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I mean, like, what are the challenges of implementing decentralized governance? The first thing that comes to my mind is just a real sense of being humbled by not only the scale of the problem, but the amount of history that one would need to study to really have an informed answer. I mean, we're talking about control and resource allocation, and that's one of the fundamental nitty-gritty problems of human history through time. And I was always the kind of kid in high school who was thinking about computers and computer games in history class. So first acknowledging my lack of depth in the subject. But the one area that I do have depth is as an entrepreneur for the last 12 years is in board meetings and in board governance for the startups that I've been on. And, I know we're not talking about implementing a DAO here, so it may not be super sexy to this audience, but if you think about board governance, it actually is kind of like high stakes distributed governance in a way. I mean, the way it typically works is that you as a founder raise VC money, and then you negotiate terms for a deal, and you give up some percentage ownership of the company in first class stock, and then you get common stock, and then you have two board directors that represent the founders, and then you have two board directors that represent the investors, and maybe you elect an independent, and this of course depends on who has leverage in the formation of the board. And then you go through on a monthly if you're a noob, quarterly if depending on the way it's set up, but quarterly you discuss the financials, the strategy, the numbers, and make decisions about resource allocation at a high level. The board hires and fires the CEO, provides governance and consent for major decisions that the startup is doing, and it's sort of a balance of lightweight tactical decision making with decentralized governance. And the way you have stake in the game is like you're staking as a VC, to use DAO parlance. You stake when you plop down a term sheet and you put money on the table. And so that's the only sort of decentralized governance that I think that I'm super well versed in. But the last startup I was on a board of, keep this between us, but it was a pretty big flail out. So I can't say that it's been a big success for me. But you try and you keep trying, and we'll see what happens with the next couple. But just recognizing, I guess the TLDR of my point is that this is an age-old problem, and it's manifested in a lot of ways. And you would have to be more of a student of history than me to really answer it in an intelligible way, I think.
Yeah, okay. No, that's really helpful. And I think that's a good point, is that in some ways, like what we are talking about here is like, it's almost politics. So it can be on a small scale if you have a more sort of centralized sort of governance process, but then if you open up to a wider community, then in a lot of cases it will come down to politics, and people are, yeah, lobbying for different sort of decisions within the sort of network. So yeah, so Lane, are you there as well?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, brilliant. So yeah, I'm not sure if you dropped off before we were asking the question, but did you have any thoughts on the challenges of implementing decentralized governance within crypto networks? Or we might even open it up to sort of like more DAOs, like sort of more generally as well.
The challenges of implementing governments right? Sorry, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, yeah, sorry, you were just cutting out a bit there.
Yeah, I'm unrelating back to turn the Wi-Fi off.
Okay, cool. I guess so I'll just give you a minute while your connection's playing up. But I think one thing that's interesting here is to sort of break it down as well, that even within the sort of crypto space, we've seen a whole bunch of different mechanisms of decentralized governance. So I guess you can have literally on-chain voting. And I think it's interesting. One of the challenges we've seen with that is like, okay, well, it's one thing to decide we should let the community vote, but what happens if a very small portion of the community votes? And then what are the implications of, say, certain very large sort of whales within the network, their weight behind these decisions? And then you've also got other networks that are sort of, I guess, relying more on social consensus. But I guess one of the challenges with that is like, okay, well, you know, how do we sort of come to a decision within a reasonable amount of time and sort of meet deadlines?
Yeah, I identify strongly with both of the points you just made. I think, you know, we spent a lot of time during the EIP0 initiative last year just trying to answer questions which on the surface should be quite straightforward, like what is the community? What are the different groups of stakeholders? What are the needs of those groups? How do we communicate with those groups and hear the needs of those groups? And, you know, I'll give you a hint, like we didn't even get past the first question. You know, I think we spent many hours to figure out like what the community is, much less what their needs are, how to communicate with them. Yeah, sorry, this is such a big topic. I mean, I feel like I could talk about this for hours. I don't want to take over the conversation, but it's so multifaceted, like you suggested.
Yeah, okay. No, that's fair enough. Okay, great. So I think one thing that might be interesting here is if we dive into, so like what steps can projects actually take to move towards decentralized governance? And out of those of you on the call that are in projects, what steps have you taken already to move towards more decentralized governance, and what's worked and what hasn't? So yeah, Doug, would you like to start, and then we can sort of...
Sure. So you know, in LivePeer specifically, what we launched with was very much an alpha. It's very much it was totally transparently that this would be kind of the first test of the network. The network would need to be iterated upon, bugs would need to be fixed, etc. And so, you know, there was explicitly, you know, not any of these aggressive kind of all-in mechanisms like on-chain voting, kind of stakeholder enabling of updates or parameter changes or anything yet. But the plan is certainly over time to get there. And you know, as you move to beta, as you move beyond that and scale the network, you want to get there. And so looking at what some projects are doing as specific examples, I actually am inspired by some experiments that are live and being run right now that are coming to some inflection points. So I look at Tezos, for example, which has on-chain governance baked in to their protocol for protocol updates. They have this kind of liquid delegated proof of stake where people make proposals for upgrades, but they have this 4-step process by which those kind of proposals make their way from proposal to enacted upgrade that takes 3 months. And because of kind of this delegation around proof of stake, they have this way to, first of all, they require, I think, 80% kind of participation in a vote before that vote can even be considered to enact an upgrade. And because of the delegation, you kind of have by default your limited number of participants who carry a lot of weight. And so you may say that that feels a little more centralized than, say, this huge global community participating, except for the fact that I believe, any token holder can, not stick with their delegator's vote and move it away if they care to actively participate. So it's like one example of how kind of voting on chain is playing out in the real world that we're seeing. I would just urge that it's great if these things can be tested on lower stakes situations than kind of the entire security of the protocol itself. I think there's other interesting examples playing out right now, like Decred has a governance mechanism baked into their consensus algorithm for kind of on-chain protocol updates, but they also have this kind of soft governance off-chain mechanism for fund allocation. And they have this forum called Politea or Politea, where people kind of discuss and engage in proposals. And so that's another really interesting thing to watch play out, because that one is soft. It is less of a kind of direct protocol commitment when these actions get confirmed. And then finally, kind of as Kevin mentioned, I think Aragon and DAO Stack are amazing in theory. I'd love to see, now that they're live, small experiments of DAOs in a box that people can begin running tests around, in lower stakes ways than kind of the entire governance of the protocol.
Okay, yeah, very interesting. And yeah, so I guess in terms of if we think about live peers, I guess, as you mentioned, there haven't been any sort of like huge experiments that would be critical to the network. But I guess, does anyone else have any examples of experiments they've run on their sort of networks, and has that worked and has that not worked?
So the Ethereum cat herders initiative that I mentioned a moment ago when I joined the call is, I would say, a new organic experiment in decentralized governance. I mean, we sort of call it project management and decentralized project management, but really it's governance as well, because like we're sort of trying to improve the all core devs process and the EIP process, which of course are the only formalized parts of Ethereum governance. One concrete thing we're doing is fundraising. I know that this was mentioned before as well. I think this is an important challenge in a decentralized ecosystem, because there isn't really a single top-down source of funding. So we created a fund on Gitcoin. Thank you, Kevin, for your help with that. We started with a very small amount of money. We want to do this in a very sort of organic, incremental fashion. And we're very fortunate to have had a bunch of people jump on that and fill that fund for an entire year within a couple of weeks. And it's the beginning of an experiment. I think we're going to be doing a lot more there around things like project management and communications. One thing we're hoping to do, knock on wood, is finally like revamp the ethereum.org website, which is, as everyone knows, like way overdue for a refresh.
Yeah, okay.
Lane, that's pretty awesome. Could you say just a couple sentences about how the governance of the funds that the Cat Herder project raised, like how the resource allocation of those funds will be carried out, or what the plan is anyway?
Yeah, totally. We're keeping it super simple. So it's just to put things in perspective. It's an extremely small amount of money. It's on the order of like $2,000, or I should say DAI right now. And it's in a multi-sig, and we have 3 key holders right now. That's Hudson, Jameson, Afri, Shuden, and myself. And right now the funds are only being used for one thing, which is funding people to take notes for things like the All Core Devs call. And again, we're just trying to do this gradually, incrementally, starting with like the least controversial thing you can imagine. 100%, right? The roadmap, like we're working on a roadmap, and that roadmap is going to lead towards full decentralization. It's going to become a DAO. Hopefully it will become bigger. Hopefully it will be able to fund a larger portion of the Ethereum ecosystem, core layer one type stuff. I've had some great conversations about that, but I just want to make 2 points, right? One is that while decentralization is super critical, it's sort of a journey, not a destination. And I don't think anyone's figured out how to do that yet, realistically, especially of large sums of money at the protocol level. And number 2, I don't think that should hold us back, right? I'm really very much a proponent for sort of progressive decentralization.
Awesome. Thank you.
No, I completely agree. All right, so that's really interesting. So did anyone in the call have any sort of questions they'd like to ask? Okay, so if not, we can just keep running through the questions we had. So I guess one sort of key sort of issue when we think about these things, I guess one other approach we haven't sort of discussed is this idea of, I guess, governance through delegation. So if you think about something like LivePeer, for example, if people are delegating to a transcoder, perhaps that transcoder is almost sort of their political candidate and is speaking on their behalf in terms of governance. So how do you guys sort of think about this sort of model of governance? And yeah, I guess what are the issues you see with it? I guess immediately I sort of think of some of the issues as similar to the issues we see in traditional politics and the sort of whole process around that.
Yeah, I really like this model as a starting point. The idea is that kind of the delegates, the limited set of validators on your network, have to participate in governance. They have to vote. They have to weigh in on whatever the kind of proposal or topic at hand is. And so you get, and you can enforce that by slashing essentially. So you can get almost guaranteed participation in governance amongst the biggest stakeholders and the people who are the most aligned with the network. So that's a positive. And then you could say, well, a negative is that it feels a little more centralized because there's only a limited number. There might be, 15 or 20 or 100 people participating. But what's nice is I think that any delegator, any token holder should also have the ability to use their own stake to weigh in and change their own vote should they want to actively participate. So they're not necessarily required because, of course, you have this huge kind of apathy problem where thousands of people are not going to be paying attention and not going to be qualified to participate or want to participate in this. But if something's important enough to them or any one individual actor, they can. So I think like experiments along these lines are really, really interesting. I think the Cosmos network is designed with this sort of primitive in mind. I mentioned Tezos before, and I think it's a powerful starting point. Again, the question is like, what are you putting at stake by opening up the entire protocol to this process? How can you run these experiments?
Yeah, okay, completely. And I guess so this one's for like Doug and Arthur. So I've noticed within both LivePeer and Foam, you both have community forums where you may not explicitly be asking the community to vote on an issue, but there's sort of a forum there for people to express their view, and the community sort of feelings and thoughts on particular decisions, they're listened to, and I guess they're yeah, it's a part of how the decision is made. So would you like to share any thoughts on that, Arthur, within Foam?
Sure. So I think the discussion board in this case informs two things. I think it's a way for people within the community to air how they think others should vote or have like a conversation around voting around specific points that are challenged on the map, which often leads to both a mix of political opinions and kind of, should we follow jurisdictions? Should we, these are very interesting conversations that definitely inform what we're doing. And we're not trying to, especially at the experimental stage, have too much of a top-down direction on how this should work. So we're kind of listening and looking at that. And then secondly, of course, we have feedback on our progress as well. So where we're taking the company, what is working, and that's the second part of it. So I think, yeah, the social layer of the TCR, and then also just informing and checking in with the community on how we're doing and what they're feeling about what we're producing. And we want to, of course, sorry.
No, I definitely wouldn't underestimate the importance of just like participation in the process through communication. I think, in the Ethereum governance, for example, that's probably one of the most active ways that you have this decentralized input process into what happens through, informal channels like Reddit, for example, for better or for worse. It's where everyone gets to kind of share their opinion, air their voice. You feel the community reaction. You get a sense for what people support or don't support. I think one of the big challenges is that a particularly vocal minority or self-interested actor on one side can really appear really loud, or can appear really influential in some way, and without some more like formal process to quantify how much of the network that opinion really represents, it's hard to know whether if it does come down to kind of a centralized decision process, you can take everything into account, but it's hard to know how much to weight kind of a loud voice amongst a minority. One example I think that's coming up in live peers, we've talked about, we have this limited number of transcoders on the network. It's 15, and it's intended to grow, well beyond that limit when we get to Streamflow to hundreds or thousands. But in the meantime, we have metrics. They're all performing pretty well. They're being responsible. We think technically we can expand beyond this limit to maybe 20 or 25, and that starts with a proposal to the forum and to the community and a call for feedback. And all evidence is that people generally support this. There's not a lot of negatives. It helps decentralize the network. But some self-interested party may say, oh, well, that may affect my economics in some way, or maybe there's some drawback. And if that happens to be a really loud voice, how do you know how much that really represents without some more like formal governance mechanisms? So you see these sorts of, the coin votes and these kind of softer polling mechanisms to get a feel, but how you translate that into action is the big challenge.
Yeah, I completely.
Doug, can I just add on to that for a quick sec? Yeah, Doug, thanks for bringing that up. I just want to agree with you completely. I think that that's one of the things that we struggle with the most in sort of the Ethereum governance process. I sort of touched upon this earlier when I said, we struggle to understand who the community is. Yeah, signaling is a huge problem, right? We have, to your point, like a very small number of people with a very loud voices. I think a great example of this recently is the debate over ProgPow and whether we should change the proof of work algorithm. Not surprisingly, this is how politics works, right? There's a small group of people, a relatively small group of people, in this case, GPU miners, who are very invested in, in this case, in making the switch, who are very, very loud as a result. And I think that sort of there's this like massive silent majority of people who sort of don't have very strong opinions, or maybe have like a weak negative opinion. We've discussed signaling again and again and again. And, sort of folks like Hudson and myself, we do our best to keep our ear on the ground and stay plugged into the community via those channels that we do have, like Reddit and Twitter. But it's hard. There's a lot of sort of gut feeling and judgment in that process, which doesn't sit well with me as a computer scientist, and as an engineer. There's been some research and some work here on collecting sort of building signaling tools, sort of things like coin votes and carbon votes. They're not great, but they are kind of one signal that we do pay attention to. I'd like to see more done there, but I also think that we need to admit that like without a proper sort of Sybil resistant tool, which I don't think we're going to have anytime soon, we're not going to have great signals.
Lane, wouldn't you say that you have like a really strong signaling mechanism, which is essentially just the version of the software that the miners themselves choose to run? So in essence, a lot of the power lies with that specific role in the network, or do you find that it's just they need the rest of the ecosystem to come along because the rest of the ecosystem is doing either the core development or running the full nodes, or kind of influencing power in some other way?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I know that, for example, Bitcoin does things like miner signaling, right? So miners can sort of set particular bits or flags on the blocks they mine to vote on initiatives like BIPs, or, which sort of branch of a fork they intend to support. We've never tried that with Ethereum. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that, for better or for worse, at least in kind of the core R&D community, people tend to think of miners in Ethereum more as dumb service providers. I don't use that word in a derogatory fashion. I just mean that they're kind of like thought of as commoditized, so to speak, right? And then if one person is not mining, kind of someone else will come in and fill their shoes. And so they're not really thought of as playing an important role in the governance process in Ethereum. I'm not sure I personally agree with that. I think they are an important stakeholder segment. Another reason is I think we're really, really afraid of chain splits, of sort of, forks in Ethereum. And for that reason, I think we make a much greater effort to align all the stakeholders leading up to a hard fork and to prevent a contentious hard fork than, for example, Bitcoin has done. It's funny, like ProgPow is a great example. We literally were having this conversation today in all core devs leading into tomorrow's call. We're sort of the core devs are kind of wringing our hands and we're saying, look, this is no longer a technical question. This is now more of kind of an ethical, philosophical question of favoring one group of miners over another. We are not qualified to make that decision. And, forking exists for exactly this reason, right? We should implement both options in the clients and let the community choose. And I still don't see that as likely because I think, again, we're just so averse to the idea of a fork in Ethereum.
Yeah, okay, I think that's a really good point, Lane. And it's very interesting when you think about, as we sort of discuss all these issues, the implications of forking and how that can sort of impact how both teams and the community thinks about these issues. So anyway, I think we're sort of getting close to the end of the hour here. But I did have one other question I'd love to sort of run through, and that is from everyone on the call, like, are there any areas of a project that we think should remain centralized in the early stages of a network? So I think one of the real interesting challenges of a large part of the crypto space is, in many cases, you're really kind of going from a centralized startup, like a small team, and where in many cases it's quite helpful to have a benevolent dictator, and then you're transitioning to a completely sort of, or gradually transitioning to a completely decentralized network. So yeah, how do you guys think about that? And are there any portions of the network you think should remain centralized in those early stages?
Oh, Kevin, you guys are kind of building from the centralized focus on the customer, focus on delivering real value and making users happy approach. And I think as a result, you guys have one of the most widely used, impactful applications in the ecosystem. So maybe you want to say a few words about how those decisions have paid off for you guys.
Yeah. I don't know how I got put in the position of being the guy talking about the benefits of centralization on the decentralized governance call, but it's fine. I'll own that hat. So I think that, like, as an ethos, I believe in decentralization for governance, distribution of resources, figuring out who gets control. I think that we've seen a lot of problems with centralized decision making. I think it was Lord of the Rings that made me feel like absolute power is absolutely corrupting, and sort of planted the seed of why decentralization is important for me. That said, I think tactical stuff that shouldn't be done in a decentralized way, and because it's much faster to be able to do certain things in tactically without having to get buy-in from a bunch of different stakeholders. And so when I think of where centralization has its place in its ecosystem, I think that the major decisions should be decentralized, and that history proves out why control and resources and all that kind of stuff should be decentralized. But I do think that once resources have been allocated to specific teams or divisions or whatever within the community, then it's okay for them to be able to run with those, to be able to run with things like that, in such a way that they can move fast and break things and deliver something. And then there should be checkpoints in which they go back for capital and then are subjected to votes from token holders and things like that. But I think that the key is that the decentralized parts of the network remain in control of decision making and strategy and executive function, and then the tactical teams that are deployed are are able to move fast and break things. And I think that, like, you know, to give us a little bit of credit, like, we have a board at Gitcoin, and they sort of like inform our strategy, and Joe is a trusted advisor to me. And so I think that we have like the makings of moving towards more decentralized governance at Gitcoin once we figure out how to move it onto the blockchain. But in terms of me being able to focus on my customer, it bears out really well to just have me be sort of a benevolent dictator for now, and push things forward. So that's the way I think about that. But I'm curious to get pushback from anyone on the call, since I'm probably arguing from a little bit of a minority position.
So Doug or Arthur, would you like to add any thoughts on that?
I think we're dealing with the paradox that we've deployed a lot of the governance stuff on chain. There's just no way to interact with it. So now there is the need for a centralized entity to build out really good interfaces, which is us, I guess, right now. Anyone could do it technically, but we are the most motivated to do it. So there's a paradox, and even in opening up the protocols on our end, there's a lot of centralized work needed to just make it accessible. Yeah, that's kind of where we're at with that balance.
I think an interesting way of looking at this is kind of, you look at it from a traditional startup perspective. There's kind of the pre-product market fit and like the post-product market fit period. And when you're in that pre-fit period, you don't yet even know or have the conviction that this network is useful or valuable or serves a real utility to people. And there you benefit from moving fast, iterating, trying experiments, like finding the right kind of framework that people can then build upon and capture value. And then once you kind of have that fit and there's true utility here, that's when it's really important that people making their own economic decisions to interact or play a role in this network have the confidence that they're not going to get kind of platformed out the way that, a Facebook or a Twitter or YouTube or whoever has kind of screwed over the developers and the stakeholders who have invested in building on sort of those platforms. And that's when moving more towards decentralization, community, stakeholder ownership totally makes sense. So again, early on, you get a lot of benefits to central decisions, but you, as you deliver more value and have these stakeholders participate, the more that you can decentralize the governance over that, probably the more resilient and global the network will become.
Doug, I have a question. I think this is like an interesting way to think about it. But my question is, like, do you think there's like what's the incentive for a project to move towards decentralization after having achieved product market fit in a centralized way? Or to anybody on the call?
Like, yeah, I mean, I'll take that one. I mean, I think that like I'm in the community and feel ethos aligned with the importance of decentralization. If if not, I'd go run a block producer on a rival network. But like when I think about it as a capitalist, I think that how do I say this in such a way that doesn't commit me to a certain path? When I think about it as a capitalist, decentralizing Gitcoin could be a liquidation event for my investors and for my team. And so by moving our cap table in ownership into tokenization and having access to a worldwide liquid market of capital that wants ownership of Gitcoin is an exit event. And so that's like the pure capitalistic reason why you would want to decentralize your project.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful. And I think that makes a lot of sense. I guess one of the challenges as well when we think about that is, I guess this problem of the silent majority and then a very sort of loud minority, like we spoke about earlier. So yeah, Lane, did you have any sort of thoughts on sort of, would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, going back to the last question you asked, I guess just a couple of quick thoughts. as I said earlier, I think I'm, very much a proponent of sort of the decentralization ethos, as we all are. But I believe very strongly in progressive decentralization. And I would actually turn your question, I believe your question was something like, which parts does it make sense to centralize early on? I would actually turn the question around and kind of say, what are the consensus critical pieces of your project, your application stack? And I actually think that probably the right thing for most projects to do is to centralize most things early on, but to identify those critical pieces of the project and decentralize just those pieces up front. And there's a reason for that, right? I think that we need to focus on things like UX and on finding product market fit early on, but we also at the same time need to be making credible commitments to our users and to the community that we're serious about decentralization, right? Credible commitments are what set us apart from the Facebooks and the Twitters. And I think like just one random example, decentralized payments, decentralized tokens, decentralized incentivization, but, maintaining a fairly centralized control of design and development early on, I think is okay.
Okay, brilliant. Well, look, guys, I think we might call it there. So thank you everyone for joining. So thanks Kevin, Lane, and Arthur. And yeah, so the call has been recorded and will be available on YouTube. Doug, did you have anything else you wanted to say before we end the call?
Thanks so much for moderating, as always, and thanks for everyone for joining and participating. This was a very different live peer community call, but it was great, and hopefully, once every month or two, we can do one of this format on a different topic.